بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, we continue our journey in this ever so special text, the Hikma of Al-Ta'iyya, the aphorisms of the great Imam of this religion, Ibn Ata'illah as-Sakandari. And we have reached aphorism number 45. And it is short in terms of number of words, but it is packed with meaning. And it is a very important aphorism that if we put into practice, there will be immense blessings in our lives. And so he says, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa ardah wa nafa'ana bih, ma qalla amalun baraza min qalbin zahidan. And in some narrations, min qalbi zahidan. Wala kathra amalun baraza min qalbin raghiban, or min qalbi raghiban. So this could translate, no deed emerging from a detached heart is insignificant, while no deed emerging from a desirous heart is significant. Or you could translate this, no deed emerging from the heart of one detached from the world is insignificant, while no deed emerging from the heart of one desirous of the world is significant. So there's actually different ways that you could summarize this aphorism. And one of them being is that detachment is the secret of the higher degrees of worship. Or you could even say that quality of worship is greater with Allah than quantity. And so there are some things that we want to understand here before unpacking its meaning. And when we start talking about a lot of worship or a small amount of worship, and when we are trying to do righteous deeds, we don't ever want to abandon deeds that we're doing based upon some fear of a disease of heart that's propelling us to do them. You keep performing the deeds that you're doing while you simultaneously try to make your heart more and more pure, and try to purify your heart and become more and more sincere. And doing good deeds is important, and we're encouraged to do so. So this in no way means that if you can do a little bit more, that somehow he's indicating here that no, intentionally do less. He's pointing to a very important meaning here. And this is the importance of this internal dimension of worship, the state of your heart, and how there might be someone who's outwardly worshiping more than you. But if their heart, but if their heart is filled with the love of this world, and even though you're worshiping less than that individual, it very well might be that your worship, which is less, is actually more with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's unpack these words. Ma qalla amalun. No deed is insignificant. Ma here is a negation. And then we have this word qalla. Qalla yaqillu is to be little, to be small in number, to be few, or you could even say insignificant. And the other meaning of qalla here is also to decrease, to diminish, to grow less. And then the word amal, of course, is your deed. The most generic way of referring to this is an action that you do, but a deed, something that you are actively trying to do as a form of worship. And then we have the word baraza. Baraza is to emerge after having previously been hidden, to appear, to come out. Min qalbin zahidan, or in some narrations, min qalbi zahidan. There's a slight difference. If we say qalbin zahidan, a heart that is zahid, and we're translating that for now as detached, and we'll get into more into that in a minute. We're saying then that that is a trait of the heart. Qalbin zahidan. That's a trait of the heart. That's the state of the heart. As opposed to if we use the idafa construct, we're saying the heart of a zahid. Essentially, it's the same meaning because ultimately the place of zuhud is in the heart. So, min qalbin, from a heart that is zahid. We'll just leave it at that for now. This word zuhud stems from a root word zahida yazhadu. And you could say zahida fihi or zahida anhu. Ay tarakahu wa raghaba anhu. It's to abstain from something, to renounce something, to abandon something. And let's look at these words even in English because they're important to get have a little bit more in-depth understanding. If we say abstain in English, we might define it in the following way: to hold oneself back voluntarily, especially from something as regarded as improper or unhealthy. And usually we have from, abstain from. Whereas the word renounce, to give up or to put aside. Abandon, to leave completely and finally. Forsake utterly. So these are all words that can be used to translate the word zuhud in Arabic. So zuhud is abstention, it's renunciation, it's abandonment. But the preferred translation that I like is really detachment. Because when you truly come to understand zuhud, you start to realize that yes, in the early stages, zuhud might mean that you actively try to take less. But as you progress spiritually, you realize the reality of zuhud is that you lack attachments. You have it in your hand, but it's not in your heart. It's the same whether you have something or whether it's been taken from you. So I really like to translate zuhud as detachment. Although those other words also work. They're different dimensions of it. And when we talk about the progression of the science of tasawwuf, and really those individuals that were closest to realizing the third pillar of Islam, which is ihsan, it all started with zuhud. And especially after that early period, when very quickly Muslims conquered lands that were quite far away. And riches and wealth and dunya flowed very quickly into the Muslim world when this was taking place. And that early generation realized we need to be careful of this. And in fact, that our Prophet ﷺ warned us of this. And he said ﷺ that he didn't fear that we were going to commit shirk and associate partners after him. But he feared is that the dunya was going to be that laid out and opened up for his ummah. And that we would compete with one another in it the way that the people before us competed for it, and that it would destroy us the way that it destroyed them. That was his worry, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was that the dunya would open up for us. And so that early generation, when they saw this, you had people who were known as zuhad. They started to renounce some of these tendencies, and they tried to take only what it is that they needed from the world. And so that's definitely a part of it. But even those who are renouncing something outwardly, if they're not detached inwardly, that's an outward manifestation. They're bereft of its reality. So if someone's doing that for people to say that he's a zahid, then what use is it outwardly if that's what's in your heart? Because one of the greatest things to have zuhud in is desiring a spot in people's hearts, status. And it's one of the hardest of all. It's one of the hardest of all. So this word zuhud is a very important word. It's one of the very important stations that we want to acquire as a believer. And there's, of course, degrees. And little by little, we want to make this our reality. But as we will see, zuhud is very unpopular, especially in the modern world. But it's one of the greatest things of all that we could offer the modern world. And as we'll come back to towards the end, when we look at some of the statements of the Sahaba, it's one of the greatest sunnahs of our Prophet ﷺ and one of the greatest abandoned sunnahs. If any one of us starts to downsize our home, or just start to give away a lot of their clothing, or start to eat a little bit less and get a little bit skinnier, people around us start to get very uncomfortable. Are you okay? What's wrong with you? Are you all right? Do you need help? Are you sick? Are you dying? People start to really worry. The expectation is that we get a bigger and bigger home and a better car and nicer clothing. And if your heart's not attached to it, there's nothing wrong with living in a nice home. But the point is that this is an abandoned sunnah. And we want to recapture it and try to implement it in a balanced way, given our own specific circumstances. But it's really about detachment of the heart. So that's why we're going to translate as detachment. And so that Victor Danner's translation, no deed arising from a renouncing heart is small. And Thomas Cleary, work that comes from an abstemious heart is never insignificant. I prefer no deed emerging from a detached heart is insignificant. While no deed emerging from a desirous heart, yani it's the opposite that he mentions here, is significant. So, ما قل عمل برز من قلب زاهدا. And then we have what he juxtaposes to that. There's a contrast here. This is why that we have while. While indicates a contrast. While ولا كثر عمل, while no deed is significant, برز من قلب راغب, emerging from a desirous heart. So it's the opposite. كثر is the opposite of قل. Kathra is to be a lot, to increase, multiply, grow, to happen frequently, occur often. It's significant, of consequence. And then we have the word baraza, again, which is to emerge. Min qalbin, and this is the opposite, raghibin or min qalbi raghibin. Raghiba yarghabu, raghiba fi shay, aradahu. وحرص عليه وطمع فيه. It's to desire something, to wish something, to want something, to covet something. رغبة. رغبة. And you could summarize that by saying one is desirous of the world. In other words, they love the world. They want the things of the world. And all of us want the things of this world. All of us, by virtue of being a human being, until you work on yourself, you want finer clothing. If you're wearing rough clothing and it's itching you, you're going to want finer clothing. If you're eating very coarse food that doesn't taste that well, you're going to like a nice, well-prepared meal that is delicious. If you are in a place where there's no air conditioning, and it's either extremely hot or extremely cold, you're going to want to have been more comfortable and have turned on the AC in the summer and the heat in the winter. It's the human nature. So it's not necessarily bad in and of itself, but when we talk about the religious virtue of zuhud and we start working on ourselves, there's extreme benefits in it. And in general, that you could say, the more that we give up from this world, the more that we're going to attain in the next. And a lot of the people that no one really wants to be around in this world and disassociates themselves from them in this world are going to enter before us by 500 years in the hereafter. We thought that they were strange or weird and didn't really understand them, while we're living very comfortably. And then when we see how quick they're going to enter into paradise in the hereafter, we're going to want to have wished to come back and live like them or in a worse off state so that we could receive what it is that they receive. And subhanAllah, the maqayis, the way that we measure things in our mind in this world, it doesn't play out how we want it to play out in the next world. We are going to be so surprised when we see that who's forgiven and who enters into paradise, because we don't know what someone's heart is in their heart. We don't know their intentions. We don't know all the details of their background. We don't know the struggles that they've been through in life. We don't know these things about people. We don't know their level of sincerity. All of that is hidden from us. And sometimes, to a certain degree, the outward is a measure. So we don't neglect the outward. And ultimately, we have to consider the outward because we're commanded to do so. But the inward is something that's hidden from us. And it's going to lead to matters in the next world that are unexpected from our perspective. So a qalban raghiban, a desirous heart. So let's look at some of the meanings of this blessed aphorism, insha'Allah ta'ala. And one of the ways that they connect this to the one that comes before it is that the one's companionship that we are taking, we really want these to be people that are not dunyawi, that are not worldly people. And oftentimes people want to hang around the popular folks. They want to hang around the cool people. They want to hang around the famous people. They want to dress like them. They want to kick it with them because they know that there's all these perks. Right? Just by being with so-and-so, all of a sudden you get such and such. And there's a lot of people. And this is not just in street culture. This is in business culture. This is at high schools. This is at colleges. This is just neighbors, friends, even in families. This happens. And that's not the type of person you really want to hang out with and spend time with. Someone who's just very worldly. The type of people that we want to spend time with are people that are detached from this world. These are the true companions. So that's the connection. And so, how do we then explain this? No deed emerging from the heart of one detached from the world is insignificant, while no deed emerging from the heart of one desirous of this world is significant. What is zuhud then? Zuhud is when the love of that particular thing is removed from our heart and we become indifferent in relation to it. And others would define it as being weary of anything that will preoccupy us from Allah and veil us from the divine presence. So that's a very strong definition. In other words, that we have to leave, abandon, renounce, detach from anything that's going to get in the way of us drawing near to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And this is really the most important criterion of all. The Sharia gives us what is permissible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that thing, just because it's permissible, is what's best for us. This is the criterion that the salik, the one treading a spiritual path, uses for his decisions or her decisions. Is this going to help my religion? Is it going to bring me closer to Allah? Or is it going to distance me from Him? Subhanahu wa ta'ala. So az-zuhd fi shay, that natural inclination that you have towards it, is now checked by the active process of spiritual struggle to replace it with something that is actually even better. And as we will see, what does it really mean to have zuhud in the dunya? And this is actually something we maybe will speak about at the end, but I thought it was a beautiful statement. And one of them that said in relation to this dunya is The dunya in and of itself is so meaningless, is that the only person that will need to have zuhud is someone who's in a state of ghafla, in a state of heedlessness, because they're considering the dunya. If someone's intelligent, they'll realize that the world is not worth living for in the first place. We're only here for a short period of time. It's like entering in one door of a house and going out another. And so when we talk about zuhud, this is not some, as you find in some wisdom traditions of the Far East, renouncing for the sake of renouncing, abstaining for the sake of abstaining. No, zuhud really is you're replacing what is inferior with what is superior, with what is lesser with that which is better. The dunya, even if you chase after it, you can never get it. And you're replacing that with the pleasure that comes from a heart that is filled with the meanings of remembrance of Allah and finding intimacy in that. And then the everlasting bliss of the hereafter. So when we call it zuhud, yes, it's zuhud because you're leaving something that's hard for the human being to leave. But in reality, when we wake up and we realize, oh my goodness, what is this world worth anyway? It's the only thing that makes sense for the intelligent person who uses their intellect. And you're essentially replacing it with what is better. So we're not just zuhud for the sake of zuhud. No, you're engaging in a process of detachment so that you can fill your heart with meaning. And one of the amazing things to think about is that the Kaaba is empty. Has anyone ever seen a picture of the Kaaba online? There's like 3 pillars. You enter into the door, and to the right there's Bab at-Tawbah, and that will take you up to the roof. And then there's 3 pillars. There's nothing in it. And that's an amazing meaning. And you compare this to many churches. I grew up as a Christian and converted to Islam. And that how fancy and ornate they are. And that glass windows with all kinds of that figures in them and pictures and that sculptures of different types and icons. So much outward stuff that preoccupies you. The Kaaba, which is the center of the world and corresponds to the center of the cosmos, which is the Bayt al-Ma'mur, is empty. Indicating is that you have to empty your heart. And when you empty your heart, it will be filled with the greatest thing of all, which is the meanings of remembrance of Allah and finding intimacy in them. And so we empty our hearts. We limit our sensory input so that our hearts can be filled with meaning. And that's the amazing thing, is that you could be with someone in the middle of the desert. And you see a picture of 2 Emirat, where Marabat al-Hajj lived a good portion of his life. It's in the middle of the desert. There's nothing around except desert and a few scattered trees. It's in the middle of the desert. But those people are some of the richest people on earth. Even though when the Fakir was studying, I think they had that second smallest GDP of all countries in the world. They were the second poorest country in the world, but they were the richest people that I'd ever met because they had these meanings. In Marabat al-Hajj, talk about zuhud, Allahu Akbar. This was a true zahid. This was a true zahid. He had 1 garment, 1 undergarment, 1 pair of that pants that he would wear, that sarawil, not pants like our pants, they were sarawil, 1 pair of sandals, only 1 of everything. And he mentioned at one point is that even though cattle is some of the greatest wealth that you can have there, previously, to a certain extent still to this day, he was thinking about giving up his cattle because it's not known that the Prophet ﷺ ever owned a cow. This is the way these people were. And towards the end of his life, people would come and ask him questions and be arguing over a piece of property some night, and he would just say, I don't want to even talk about the dunya. He didn't want to hear about it. And the fard kifaya could be fulfilled by many of the other scholars that are around him. If he was needed, of course, he would have answered, but there was no need for him. He was a person of the akhirah. And what did he miss from this world? What did he miss? Nothing. What did he miss from staying in 5 or 6 or 7-star hotels and taking fancy vacations on islands and eating the most delectable food that the world has to offer and that all this type of stuff? What did he miss? Nothing whatsoever. Were you to know what is in his heart and what he's experiencing? Allah, from nafahat, and that these blessings that Allah Ta'ala gives to the elective, the awliya and the salihin, is that the world in its entirety does not equal one moment of what Allah Ta'ala brings to the heart of someone like that. These are people that understand. And I remember in Mauritania, subhanAllah, that was one of the great blessings of being there. Things were crystal clear. The dunya pollutes things. It clouds your perspective to the extent that we let it in. There, things were crystal clear. You knew you're going to die. You know you need to learn your deen and to put it into practice and prepare. That's crystal clear. That's life. Ilm and amal. Life essentially is knowledge and practice. That's life. And yes, we might have to work a little bit. And so work, have a job, take care of your family. But that's life. Ultimately, it's preparing for the meeting with Allah Jalla Jalaluh. And so then Sidi Ahmed ibn Ajiba, he talks about various degrees of this zuhud. And he says it starts with having zuhud in wealth, where you start to detach and you start to cut back, and that only take what you need in terms of mal, wealth and property. And then this has a sign. Is that, this is super lofty. Where are we from this? Is that gold and dirt is the same to you. That silver and rocks are the same to you. Wealth and poverty is the same to you. That being given something or being withheld from something is the same to you. This doesn't mean that you don't fulfill the responsibility of providing for your families and things, but this is the state of this individual, and there's people that are like this. That's what he means by buruda, that you become indifferent to the world. And this is the sign of that very special Sahabi that the Prophet ﷺ woke up in the masjid and asked how he was that morning. He said he became a true believer. He says, look at what you're saying, because every truth has a reality. And then one of the first things that he mentioned was, azafat nafsi anid dunya. My nafs, my soul is turned away from this world. And gold and that dirt is the same to me. This is what he said. What a state of heart. Imagine. Think about how many people die for dunya and fight over dunya and argue over dunya and hate over dunya and envy over dunya and show arrogance. Think about how the dunya spoils everything. So it starts with wealth. And then after that is that jah, status, renown, being known, being respected. He says the sign that we now are having zuhud in jah is that whether we are honored or humiliated is the same to us. You don't ever intentionally humiliate you. That a believer never intentionally humiliates himself. In the stories that you hear of the great Salihin that did things to break their arrogance, those are rare stories for the elect of the elect that have their place in certain extreme conditions. So we don't deny those. But in general, even people who are treading the spiritual path, you don't humiliate yourself. You carry yourself with dignity as you're supposed to do. But if while you're carrying yourself with dignity, people insult you, they curse you, they say bad things about you, or they humiliate you, how do you respond? Right? We have in our culture, like someone said, you better recognize. Oh, a'udhu billah. That's evil. Don't you know who you're talking to? These types of things that people say. You better watch yourself. All these type of things that people say. A'udhu billah. That's nafs. It's nafs. Even if they have someone that they can put a hit on you, just, okay, take care of fulan. Even if they have money and they can, that get you to lose your job or whatever. A'udhu billah. That's not our response. Our response is we see ourselves worse than anything anyone could possibly say about us. So it's the same. Whether we're humiliated or whether we're honored. Whether we're known or whether we're hidden. Whether we're praised or whether we're criticized. It's the same. And again, these are lofty states, but do you see the healing in this? You see the healing in this? And again, these are states we work towards. And it doesn't negate, from a Sharia perspective, dealing with people's basic psychological and emotional needs. They're not in contradiction. But moving towards this understanding, which is a spiritual understanding, which requires deep healing, is enriching for the human being. Because this dimension, i.e. that of the spirit, this dimension of healing is the source of all other dimensions. And then the next one that he mentions is for those who reach these states. Those who don't desire even lofty stations or even desire karamat, breaking them the norms to happen at their hands, or to have special things about them. In the lower stages, we're supposed to desire lofty stations. But as you progress, you realize this whole affair is about submission. You realize this whole affair is about becoming abd and being a servant of Allah. And once you become an abd, la ilaha illallah, then you're no longer bothered. You're happy when other people receive. And you're content where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed you. And this is one of the greatest things that you could possibly be realized in. And that when someone is realized in these meanings, all khair comes to them. And they're raised to the highest of degrees. And the sign that someone is realized in this is that fear and hope, strength and weakness, bast and qabd. For them, they don't desire to be in any state other than the one Allah has placed them in. There's times where we should have overwhelming fear. There's times that we should have that overwhelming hope. There's times where we're weak. There's times where we're in a position of strength. There's times where of expansion. There's times of constriction. And the only other degree after this is where someone has complete zuhud in the entire relation to the entire cosmos. Bishuhud al-Mukawwin. Because they're in a state of divine witnessing of the one who brought it into existence. So, as we move up in these various degrees, and we have to work on it little by little, little by little, little by little, and we have to reflect upon this virtue, look in our own selves. Where are we at? Is our problem here, or is our problem there, or is it here? Does it relate to food? Does it relate to sleep? Does it relate to our interactions with the opposite gender? Does it relate to that money? Does it relate to status? All of these different things. And work on ourselves. And someone who starts to detach in this way, and they start renouncing and giving up the things of this world, because your heart, the more that is filled with the love of the world, the less it will be filled with the love of Allah. It's that simple. The love of this world and the love of the hereafter, the love of Allah, are like the east and the west. The closer you get to one, the further you are from the other. If you start walking towards San Francisco, you're getting further away from New York. The closer you get to San Francisco, the further you are from New York, and the opposite. And we want to have the love of Allah in our heart. And it is a prerequisite to reach the higher degrees of the love of Allah that we start to renounce this world. Because we know Allah gives this world to those whom He loves and to those whom He does not love, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But He only gives the hereafter in religion, deen, to the people whom He loves. So this person's worship is different now. And this person is moving up in degrees of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there is a hadith that says, عَمَلٌ قَلِيلٌ فِي السُّنَّةِ خَيْرٌ مِنْ عَمَلٍ كَثِيرٍ فِي بِدْعَةٍ. Doing a lesser amount of deeds in following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is better than doing a lot of deeds when you are actually doing things that are innovations. And Sidi Ahmed ibn Ajiba then connects this meaning to zuhud. And he says that وَأَيُّ بِدْعَةٍ أَعْظَمُ وَلَا أَشْنَعُ مِنْ حُبِّ الدُّنْيَا. What innovation is greater than the love of this world? And immersing yourself in it and engrossing yourself in it at the level of heart and your physical body. Because he says, this didn't exist during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. This didn't exist during the time of the Sahaba. They were people of zuhud. And so what he's indicating us to is that if you would ask someone, is zuhud one of the great sunnahs of our Prophet ﷺ, people might have to think about it a little bit. Be like, oh yeah, that's a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But they might not intuit it. They might not respond immediately. It might take them some time to think about it. For us, that should be immediate knowledge. Of course, not only is it one of the sunnahs, it's one of the greatest sunnahs. So to leave that is bid'ah. That's the essence of what innovation is. You're leaving something that you are absolutely certain was one of his main sunnahs, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And this is bid'ah. And when we start to remove this from our heart, our worship starts to take on a greater meaning. And then they offer this similitude for us to think about. And they say, imagine two people, both of whom gift a king. So we only know this really through the movies, kind of how that was. So imagine a king is receiving a gift from a visitor. And there's two visitors that come at the same time. One of them gives him a very small but beautiful ruby. And another one gives him that 60 chests, but there's nothing in them. So you can imagine that even if it's a small ruby, it's rare, but it's precious. It's rare and precious. He's going to be impressed. He's going to keep that. But if you give him 60 chests and there's nothing in them, like, what's the point of that? It's almost as if you're belittling someone and poking fun by doing something like that. Or you could think of it as that the way we have different notes. So the largest note that's ever been issued by the Federal Reserve is a $10,000 bill. But these are discontinued. And apparently even $1,000 bills, $5,000 bills, I've actually seen, I think, a $1,000 bill, $500 bill, these aren't really in use anymore. But it's the same note. One of them is worth $1, the other one's worth $10,000. Or think of a check. There's $100 on there, or there's $100,000 on there. It's the same one. One is worth a lot more than the other. Or a closer metaphor to this is, imagine stacks and stacks of ones. Right? Okay, how much is that ultimately going to equal? And then one bill that's actually $10,000. And so the point here is, is that these are metaphors to come help us understand this meaning. Detachment is the secret for us to move up in degrees of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for our worship to become more meaningful. And specifically, this is why he's mentioning it, for us to come to know Allah. This is what we have to do. And we're going to look at a number of statements here too that help us understand it. And he mentions one of his teachers as saying, the one who desires this world is heedless, even if he's making a lot of dhikr on his tongue. He said, because it's not about what you're saying on the tongue. It doesn't mean that you leave it either. It doesn't mean that you leave it. We already talked about that in the beginning. You keep doing it, but you work on yourself and try to detach internally. And he said that the one who has renounced this world and is detached from it, he is in a state of remembrance perpetually, even if he doesn't remember that much upon his tongue. And Sayyid Ahmed Nabajib says, this is how some of them explain the verse, لا يذكرون الله إلا قليلا. They only remember Allah a little bit. أي مع الغفلة, in a state of heedlessness and being desirous of this world, even if they're doing it a lot outwardly. Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib said, you should be more concerned with the acceptance of actions than their performance, because no act is insignificant when it is accepted and when it's accompanied with taqwa, mindfulness of Allah. Look at this amazing statement of Ibn Mas'ud. This is how the companions understood it. رَكْعَتَيْ مِنْ زَاهِدًا عَالِمًا. 2 rak'ahs from a zahid, someone who's detached from the world, and they're an alim, they're knowledgeable. خَيْرٌ. It's better than وَأَحَبْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ, and more beloved to Allah, مِنْ إِبَادَةِ الْمُتَعَبِّدِينَ الْمُجْتَهِدِينَ إِلَى آخِرِ الدَّهْرِ أَبَدًا سَرْمَدًا. Then all of the worship of all of those who are struggling to do a lot of worship combined until the end of time forever. Rak'atain, 2 rak'ahs of someone who's knowledgeable and they're detached from this world is better and more beloved to Allah than the worship of those who are struggling and doing everything they can to do abundant worship combined until the end of time forever. Subhanallah. And one time that someone said to Imam Abu Hassan al-Shadhili, why is it that I see people respect you so much and you don't seem to have a lot of deeds? And of course, Imam Abu Hassan al-Shadhili had a lot of good deeds. And he responded by saying, بِسُنَّةٍ وَاحِدَةٍ افترضها الله على رسوله تمسكت بها. One sunnah that Allah made an obligation upon His messenger that I've adhered to. And he says, what is that? He says, turning away from people like you and your worldly thing, your worldly pursuits, your world literally. Khalas, there's a secret. And Sidi Ahmad Zaruk says is that the people of Zuhud have this virtuous state because of 3 reasons. One, because of when you are a person of Zuhud, of detachment, your heart is freed from preoccupations. Secondly, it's a sign that you're sincere in your love for Allah. And thirdly, it's an indication of your knowledge of Allah and that other traits that you have inside as a result. So this aphorism also teaches us and points to the reality of Zuhud really is in the heart. And to the degree that we have love of dunya in it is to the degree that our sincerity will be tainted. Because essentially sincerity, and this is how some commentators speak of this aphorism, they focus on sincerity. By having zuhud, that it makes you more sincere. Because in order to truly become sincere, you have to sever the various attachments to the world. All of the worldly attachments that we have take ultimately from our sincerity. And so those worldly attachments and our desire for them are what muddle our heart and to make it murky. So as we start to sever them, we start to become more sincere. And we start to realize is that the essence of righteous deeds after belief in divine unity is zuhd, is renouncing the world. And this is one of the greatest sunnahs of our Prophet. This is one of the greatest practices of the companions that they learn from the Messenger of Allah. And this is one of the greatest secrets on why they are close to Allah. And this is why he mentions it as an aphorism. This is one of the greatest secrets of the spiritual path, so that the acts that we do, even if they be few, even if they be less than someone in our time or in a previous time, because of that state of renunciation and detachment, they weigh heavier in the scales. They lead to more reward. But most importantly, they are means for the removal of veils between us and Allah. It is a means for us to come to know Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us to be people of zuhud and to move up in His degrees and to perform deeds in a way that is most pleasing to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe He give us tawfiq in all of our affairs. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.